And okay. So I always think it's a good idea to point out that the idea of self-control has been around a long time. You know, actually, the Adam and Eve story is at its central feature is one of self-control. You know, would you sacrifice eternal happiness for an apple? There's a great quote from David Leibson. I'll let you read this, but I'll say it out loud while you're doing it. David Leibson's a well-known economist. I think it's just a great quote. He said, there's a fundamental tension in humans and other animals between seizing available rewards in the present and being patient for rewards in the future. Now, we want chocolate, cigarettes, and a trashy movie. In the future, we want to eat fruit, quit smoking, and watch Bergman films. It captures the essence of it. So let me just spend a couple of quick minutes talking about why self-control matters. One study that was it's not too old, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, reported that when kids have higher scores at being able to exercise self-control as early as age 4, that those higher scores in later life, decades later, predict less sickness, higher income, a reduced likelihood of being a single parent, and lower rates of crime. It's striking. Another study in New Zealand followed 1,000 people who were born in 1972 or 1973, and they followed them through 38 years of age, which is a remarkable study. And they collected data on them at regular intervals, at lots of different ages, and the vast majority of the people stayed in the study, 95%, that entire time. And in their first decade of life, in their first 10 years, the people in the study assessed the impulsivity of these children, their ability to tolerate frustration, their persistence, etc. And they had staff observations in their clinic and reports from parents and teachers. And so here's some of the findings. Those compared with those who had high self-control scores, those who had low levels of self-discipline as children, in adolescence, they were more likely to be high school dropouts, more likely to be teen parents, more likely to be smoking. As adults, they were more likely to report an addiction to either tobacco, alcohol, or drugs, more likely to have a criminal record, more likely to have a low credit score, and more likely to have a prolonged dependence on welfare. They also tended to be in lower paying, lower skilled jobs and to have fewer financial assets. Now, self-control didn't predict what kinds of careers people went into, but it did predict how well they did in those careers. That's striking. Yeah? And ironically, the less self-control these adult study participants had displayed in childhood, the weaker their parenting skills that they exhibited when they had their own kids who were 3 years old. Here's some other examples of self-control challenges. One study, kind of a clever idea, looked throughout historical data to try to estimate the percentage of deaths in the year 1900 versus the year 2000 that could be attributed to temptation of some kind. There was a big jump from 10% to 40%. That is to say, temptation and our absence of self-control is increasingly affecting our health. Now, of course, in the year 1900, remember that many other causes of death, bacterial infection, pneumonia, etc., flu, etc., are much more prominent and more difficult to treat. But today, the point is that many things that are affecting our health are due to our inability to resist temptation. Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist from Duke, asked an interesting question. He said, would you be willing to inject yourself with interferon, which has quite a few bad side effects, 3 times a week to eliminate the potential long-term effects of Hep C on your liver. Well, and this actually happened to Dan Ariely in Israel when he was there, and he was the only person in the trial who actually followed that protocol for 18 months. That's what we call present bias. People are willing to kind of, look at, I'm willing to give up whatever future benefits come from reducing the long-term effects of Hep C to get rid of these side effects now. Some people have argued that many people's reactions to global warming have to do with a present bias. People say, well, look, it's not occurring now, or at least if it is, it's not occurring all that much. It's likely to happen to other people first. I can't easily see its progression on any one person, and my own actions probably won't have a major impact. So in the end, I'm really not that concerned about it now. It's something that's out there in the future. Let's focus on what we want to enjoy now rather than future generations. And some people would argue that's a present bias. That's a self-control issue. Oops, there we go. Another example has to do with savings rates. If you go back many decades, 4, 5, 6 decades ago, double-digit savings rates were the norm in the United States. But by 1994, well, it's 2.5 decades ago, right? Savings rates in the United States were down to 5%. And in 2006, which was just a couple of years before the start of the financial crisis, the savings rate in the U.S. was actually below 0. That means the average American was actually spending more than he or she earned. That's stunning. In contrast, Europeans on average save about 20% of their income, Chinese up to 50%. We don't save. That's, again, a present bias. I want to spend it now. I'm not worried about the future. Another phenomenon we see is that the average American family has a lot of credit cards and average debt on those cards of $9,000. On the flip side, individuals who are willing to delay gratification have higher FICO scores. So that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind. So we often kind of give up on our long-term goals for our immediate gratification. That's the essence of it all. When we're in a cool state, not an emotional state, very rational state, we promise that we're going to save our money, we're going to exercise, we're going to watch our diet. But when the moment comes, we most frequently don't. Okay? I'm not arguing that decisions made in a cool state are always better. I don't think that's true. But the bottom line is, more often than not, we make better decisions in a cool state. We've talked about that. So people, when talk about self-control, they talk about our far-sighted planner, where we're being very reflective, and our more myopic doer. And these things seem to have, based on neuroeconomics and fMRI scans, seem to indicate that different parts of our brain get tempted and other parts enable us to resist that temptation. So again, we have this phenomenon that I've talked about several times where different parts of the brain seem to be active, or at least more active, when we're dealing with these kind of long-term planning versus short-term doing gratification decisions. And ultimately, our self-control, of course, is undermined by temptation. Right? Anything we want to consume more of in a hot or emotional state is something that's called a temptation. And by mindlessness. When we're on automatic pilot, we're not really actively paying attention to the task at hand. Some people use the term want versus should. Want is what I want now, in the moment. Should is what I think I ought to do when I'm being more deliberative. So here's the problem, that in the moment, visceral factors, things that I feel, emotions, cravings, overwhelm my long-term decisions. So I know that I should, my should in a deliberative state, say, look, I'm going to lose weight. But in this more visceral short-term state, my want preferences take over, and then I wind up saying, I'll take that cheeseburger with the extra fries. And part of the reasons why I think that's happening, and we know that's happening from research, is that we think about events differently in the short term and the long term, in the want versus the should. And one of the ways we think about them differently is we change the level of abstraction that we use. Events that are happening to us right now, we don't think of very abstractly. We think about them in very tangible, concrete ways. But when I think about the future, I tend to think about those same kinds of things in a more abstract way. Let me give you an example, just taking an example of a salad, okay? If I'm thinking about the more distant future, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, I tend to have what I call a high-level construal, high way of thinking about, an abstract way of thinking about a salad. That is, I think about salads as healthy, and you know, if I eat more salad, maybe I'll live longer. Very abstract kind of thoughts. But at the moment, when I'm faced with eating a salad, now I have this kind of lower level of construal, my want self, as it were, and what I'm focused on is how the salad will taste. And it won't taste as good as a cheeseburger. And you know what? I think when I'm done with it, I'm going to be hungry, which is what always happens to me, at least. Maybe I'm not eating enough salad. I'm not sure. You folks might have some advice for me on that. Now, a couple of other things that I want to close up on before I kind of get into some concrete ideas with you is that we tend to make decisions that favor what we should do when we're making decisions that will take effect in the future. So, for example, the idea of going to the gym tomorrow is more palatable than the idea of going to the gym right now. The idea of eating better starting next week is more palatable and more desirable than the idea of doing that right now. Because right now I want ice cream. That is to say, we make better decisions about what we should do when we're committing to do something in the future. So one thing we're going to talk about in a little bit is how can we commit now to do something in the future. Here's a simple example of how, again, we can see these effects of should versus want. Now, I realize, of course, that nobody rents DVDs anymore, I guess, except for libraries. I guess I know a bunch of people who do that. But most of the time, of course, we don't do that. But it was only up until a few years ago that you know, people used to rent DVDs all the time. And of course, these are fascinating databases for people to look at real-world behavior. And what you found is that when people rent 2 or more DVDs, what they often do is they'll rent one DVD that's kind of would be categorized as a should DVD. Oh, this is the kind of thing I should be watching. Maybe it's a documentary of some kind, or kind of a serious film. And they also, of course, rent want DVDs. Those are things that are, you know, action films or, you know, romantic comedies or whatever. And it turns out that when people do that, they often would rent the should DVDs earlier than the want DVDs. So that documentary, they might rent that on a Monday. That action film, they might rent that on a Wednesday or a Thursday, but they return them in the opposite order. And in other words, what's clear is that they didn't get to the should DVDs very quickly. You know, they got to the want DVDs quickly. It's also true that people tend to favor want options or should options differently, depending on whether or not they're evaluating these options one at a time or simultaneously. And let me give you a quick example of that. Okay, people were given in a study, real world behavior, presented with opportunities to donate to wildlife charities. I mean, an example could be a charity that protects kangaroos or something, you know, or charities that support human health or safety. Like, for example, a charity that would provide free skin cancer checkups to farm workers. Now, donating to a wildlife charity is, the researchers thought of as, that's kind of a want option. It's more immediately emotionally attractive to do that. But charities that promote human health and safety, that seems like a should option. It's more pragmatically important in the long run. At least many people would argue that. So what happens is if you present people with those options, one at a time, so they're looking at only one option, they're more likely to give to the wildlife charity. People who are presented with the wildlife charity option are more likely to give to that than people who are presented with the charity that helps human welfare. But when you present both at once and you say, which would you like to give to? That's called joint decision making. You're seeing both options at the same time. Now, people are more likely to give to the human welfare option. That is to say, people seem to make should decisions, more rational, kind of longer term decisions, when they're comparing two things simultaneously. Okay. So now let me turn to talk about how, given all this, what do you do to exercise better self-control? What can you do and what can I do? So I want to talk about some self-control strategies, and that's what I'm going to do for most of the time that we have remaining here, okay? So as a starting point, it's an interesting story of two economists who noticed they were putting on weight in graduate school. And they made an agreement with each other. Each one of them committed to losing 30 pounds over 9 months, which, as many of you know, 30 pounds is a lot of weight. And their agreement, and they made up a legal agreement about this, is that if either failed, he'd have to pay the other one $10,000. Wow. Well, both of them did it. Both of them did it. The $10,000 seemed to drive them to do it. They lost the 30 pounds. But once that happened, they wanted to keep the weight off. So they thought to themselves, again, these are economists, they think very rationally, how can we ensure that we'll keep this weight off? So they came up with a new agreement. And the new agreement was that either one of them, with just 1 day's notice, could call for a weigh-in. And if the other person was over the target weight, that the person who was over the target weight would have to pay the other person a certain amount of money. Well, that's an interesting self-control strategy. Sounds pretty rational, but I don't know that most of us could pull that off. A lot of times when people talk about self-control strategies, they use the term Ulysses contract. Now, I don't want to pretend that I've ever read Ulysses. I've never read Ulysses. I've never read the Odyssey, which is where I believe the story of Ulysses comes from. But I do know this. There's a famous story as part of Ulysses where Ulysses was very concerned that he and his sailors would succumb to the songs of the sirens, and that would lead them into a bad place in the ocean, and where they would ultimately crash. And Ulysses understood this and wanted to make sure that he didn't succumb to temptation, nor would anybody else on his crew do that. So what he did is he instructed everybody in his crew to bind him to the main mast of the ship, tie him up so that he couldn't get away, and to ignore any instructions he offered to try to get away. He also told them all to put something in their ears so they wouldn't be able to hear the sirens. They wouldn't be able to hear the siren song. In essence, he was anticipating the temptation and taking steps in advance to limit the likelihood that they would succumb to that temptation. And this particular model of anticipating temptation and taking steps in advance to limit the likelihood that you'll succumb to that temptation has become known as creating a Ulysses contract. And I'm going to talk about several examples of this with you. Okay? So here's some simple ones. What if you prepaid your personal trainer? I don't know if any of you have a personal trainer, but what if somebody prepaid their personal trainer and they couldn't cancel? So they can't get their money back. Well, that tends to provide an incentive for them to go there. A classic one that a lot of people use is something simple like this. It's done with food all the time. I know I'm the kind of person who's going to eat a lot of ice cream if I have a lot of ice cream in the house. So I don't let myself have ice cream in the house, or if I do, I only buy a small container of ice cream, not a large one. I don't buy potato chips and leave them in the house because if they're there, I'll eat them. So what you're doing in those circumstances is an example of a Ulysses contract. I know what I'm going to do, so I'm taking steps now to prevent that from being able to happen. I love this idea. Imagine there was an alarm clock that could somehow be connected to your bank account, so that for every extra minute you slept past the alarm, money would be given to a charity that you don't like. That'd be an interesting self-control strategy. Well, here's another example. It was tried at Panda Express, and it worked. Panda Express did studies at their stores where they found that if they asked customers, would you like a smaller portion? So customers are ordering. They're asking them, would you like a smaller portion? Costs the same, but would you like a smaller portion? 1/3 said yes. Now, there's no reason to say yes other than that's a great way of exercising self-control, because you know that if you have the larger portion in front of you, you're likely to eat this. And I do this all the time. There's a delightful Italian restaurant that my girlfriend and I go to right here in town. Just a terrific place. Their portions tend to be very large. And I really need to learn to exercise this, because I know that when I order the ravioli and the meatballs, it's too much for me. But once it's in front of me, I wind up eating the whole thing. But of course, what would be much smarter is to say, listen, instead of giving me 6 raviolis, why don't you give me 3 raviolis? And instead of 2 meatballs, give me 1, and then put the other ones in a to-go package. I'll take them home and I'll have them later this week. That'd be a good example of a Ulysses contract. And another example of a Ulysses contract is a number of states have created mechanisms where a gambler can put themselves on a list that bans them from entering a casino. So you actually, while you're in a cool state, you're putting yourself on a list where you can't get into the casino, because you know that once you get into the casino, you're going to have a problem. Now, most of you are way too young to remember what a Christmas savings club is. So, as the old guy here, I'll tell you. Here's the way Christmas savings clubs worked. In November of a particular year, you would open an account at your local bank. You would commit to depositing a specific amount of money each week for the next 12 months. So, for example, you put this money in. Every time you get paid, you put the money in. And you do this for 12 months. Now, what's interesting about this Christmas savings club is it's not liquid. That is to say, you're not allowed to take your money out for 12 months. You have to put the money in, but you can't take it out. And there's usually either no interest or an incredibly low interest rate on it. Okay? Of course, 12 months later, when you go to take the money out of your account, it's just in time for you to do your Christmas shopping for the next Christmas season, and now you've got some money. Now, this is a weird thing. You're committing to put money into a savings account. It's not liquid. You can't access your money, and you're making almost nothing off of that investment. Yet, hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions of people across the country did it, and did it for years, for decades. And some people might say, well, that's crazy. Why would they do that? Well, the absence of liquidity was exactly the point of the Christmas Savings Club. People knew that if I can get my hands on this money over the next 12 months, damn it, I'll probably spend it. So I want to put it into an account where the bank won't even let me have it for 12 months. I'm going to keep putting it into this account. I can't get it for 12 months. I'm preventing myself. It's a Ulysses contract. I'm preventing myself from doing something stupid that I think I'm likely to do. Now, these savings clubs, of course, have largely disappeared as credit cards have become more and more popular. But, in the end, really, don't you think earning 0 interest for 12 months is a better deal than paying 18% in your credit card debt? Well, another example of a self-control strategy is that the majority of Americans, about 3/4 of Americans, get a refund when they file their federal tax return. I certainly do. I get a very large refund, actually. The average refund that Americans get is over $2,000, and I'm embarrassed to admit that the refunds I get are generally a good deal larger than that. And you know, the bottom line is, you and I both know that that tax refund is really basically the fact that I could have had less money deducted and then not gotten any refund at all, just come out exactly at zero. Because when I'm overpaying, when I'm over deducting and putting too much money in throughout the year, you know, basically I'm making an interest-free loan to the government, which is not very attractive. But a lot of us, and I'm like this, I kind of prefer the refund because it's almost a way that forces me to save. I know from experience that the amount of money that I set aside, not only out of my LaSalle income, but out of my consulting income, which is 1099 income, so I have to pay estimated taxes on that. And I pay pretty high estimated taxes. I usually pay estimated taxes of about 35 to 40%, which I know is well higher than what I'm actually going to owe at the end of the year. But you know what? It creates a circumstance where I've paid in all this money in advance, and when I file my tax returns, I'm going to get a refund. And that refund, it comes all at once, and I can do something useful with it. For me, one of the things I do with my refund is I usually set aside a huge chunk of my refund for charity. And that's my way of making sure that I'm going to give a lot of money to charity at some point, you know? So, but would I do that if I was you know, paying precisely what I ought to pay? You know, Walt Schubert from the finance department, I don't know if you know Walt, he's a great guy. He always says your goal when you're paying into, you know, when you're having withdrawals from your income should be that you will owe absolutely nothing on your tax return, and you'll also get no refund. That should really be your goal if you're rational. But I disagree. I think if you're rational, you're making a Ulysses contract with yourself a lot. And you're saying, you know what, I know I'm probably overpaying. I've overpaid in the past. I've done it consistently, but I like getting that refund all at once. Maybe I set it aside for charity. I set it aside for my vacation. I set it aside for my kids' education, whatever it is. It's a classic Ulysses contract. Another example of a Ulysses contract is what's called mental accounting. This is something I do. I don't know if you do it, but I actually have an Excel file. It has a budget for me every month, and there's a certain amount of money. So it has line items, right? So there's a certain amount of money for you know, for food and for groceries and for utilities and on and on and on. My Excel file has about 15 or 16 line items on it for every month. And what happens in mental accounting is you say, listen, I won't make any purchase once one of those line item accounts is depleted. Now, of course, there's more money in my savings or checking account. It's all there. These are artificial line items, right? But if I mentally say to myself, listen, even if I have unspent money in another account, I will not spend money on a restaurant if my restaurant line item is already spent for the month. It's another example of a self-control strategy. Yet another example is something my father-in-law used to do really well. My father-in-law would go to the casino, and if he won some money early in the day, he would take the money that he won and he'd put it in one of his pockets. He'd take the money that he brought to gamble with, to start with, and he'd put it into his wallet. And then for the rest of the day, he wouldn't touch the money in the wallet. That's the money he walked in with. He put it back in his wallet. He's not going to touch it. He will gamble for the rest of the day with whatever money he had initially won that morning. He just put that, he called that house money, and he would just keep going. And if he had house money at the end of the day, he'd go home. And if he ran out of house money, he still wouldn't take money out of the wallet. That's another example of mental accounting. Well, here's another example. In one study, a typical household had over $5,000 in liquid assets. These liquid assets were usually in savings accounts that earned very low rates of interest. But and again, these are thousands of households, that those same typical households had $3,000 in credit card balances, paying very high interest rates. Now, anybody who knows anything about finance knows that this is crazy at some rational level. Why not take the money out of your savings account and pay off the credit card debt? You can think of it as an arbitrage opportunity, right? Look at why I'm earning almost no interest on the money in this savings account. Why don't I just take it and pay off the credit card balance on which I'm paying an interest rate of over 18%? But most households don't do that. Now, at some level, we might say, well, that's crazy. But maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it is rational. Maybe a lot of these people realize, listen, I've borrowed to the limit on my credit card. If I pay off the debt, the balance on my credit card, if I take money out of my savings, pay off everything on my credit card, I know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to start spending money on the credit card again. But right now, if I've basically maxed out on my credit card balance, I can't spend anymore. So it's not a good idea for me to take money out of savings and pay off my credit card balance, because I'm just going to run up the debt again. Well, that's another example of mental accounting. Recent study, bank in the Philippines, they got in touch with some of their former clients, offered them a choice between two kinds of savings products. One was a standard savings account. The other was what they called a commitment savings account. And this is a lot like a Christmas club. They said, listen, you put money into the savings account. When you put the money into the account, you can't withdraw it until you reach a savings goal that you will select or a date that you will determine. So you can't access your money. Now, both accounts are earning the same rate of interest. So, why, again, put money into an account where you can't access the money until a predetermined date or a savings goal that you set? So the only incentive that you'd have to put money into that commitment savings account is because you want to stop yourself from impulsively withdrawing money and spending the money. And it turns out that 28% of people were willing to put money into that commitment account, and those people saved dramatically more, 81% more, than those who picked the other accounts. All right, let me skip over a couple things here. Just for the sake of time, you can read on these if you want. Here's some other things about self-control. Real data. So imagine a scenario where you've got 3 people who are doing time in an Israeli prison. Each one of them appears before a parole board on the same day. Each has completed at least 2/3 of his sentence. The parole board grants parole to only one of them. Which one? Well, the first case, heard it around 9 a.m. in the morning. It was Arab Israeli serving a 30-month sentence for fraud. Second case, they're hearing at 3:10 in the afternoon. Jewish Israeli serving a 16-month sentence for assault. Third case, 4:25 p.m. an Arab Israeli serving a 30-month sentence for fraud. Who got the parole decision? Who was granted parole? Well, it was the one that was at 8:50 a.m. The one was at 9 a.m. And they analyzed over 1,100 cases, because I want to make sure you don't think this is just a trivial example. And those who appeared before the parole board early in the morning received parole 70% of the time. But those who appeared late in the day received parole less than 10% of the time. And the order in which they appeared was entirely random. This points to a phenomenon in exercising self-control that you might not be aware of, but it's a good thing for you to be aware of, called decision fatigue. It's not like physical fatigue, where you're really aware of the fact that you're tired, but as you make more decisions, we tend to act more impulsively, or we don't do anything. An example. If you have to fend off temptation multiple times during the day, eventually you become less able to resist other temptations. You know, you ever have this happen to you? Hey, I had a healthy breakfast, I had a healthy lunch, I didn't stop and go down to the ice cream truck at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to get the ice cream, and now I'm home, but now it's really, really hard for me to fend off to avoid temptation. One study was done on a shopping mall. Real people, real shoppers, interviewed people about their experiences shopping that day. They also asked these people to solve some simple arithmetic problems. Solve as many as you could. You can quit anytime you want. The more decisions that shoppers had made earlier while they were in the mall, the more quickly they gave up on the math problems. That's an example of decision fatigue. Another great example of decision fatigue was in German car dealerships. I don't know if they were BMW or Mercedes or what, but all three of these researchers are very well known. And so they're real customers spending their own money. And once customers buy the cars, then they have to decide what options are they going to pick, right? So that there's dozens of options they have to make decisions about. What gear shift knob do you want? What wheel rims do you want? What configurations of the engine and gearbox? What colors do you want, etc. Now, for each of these things, there's a default option, except I think for color, but everything else has a default option. But there's tons and tons of decisions you have to make. So the more tough choices customers have to make early in those processes, the more they become fatigued and settle for the default option later on. So early on, they're considering carefully what their options are, right? But they eventually become tired of that, and they just go increasingly with the default options on later choices. And what they did in this study is they actually manipulated the order of the car buyer's choices. And they found that by doing this, customers settled for different options. And the average difference totaled more than 1,500 euros. 1,500 euros, sorry, not dollars, 1,500 euros per car. So in the end, whether customers paid a little extra money for a fancy wheel rim or a lot for a powerful engine depended on when that choice was offered to them, early or late in the decision process. Those are examples of decision fatigue. So one of the key things to remember here is that the people who have the best self-control are the ones who use their willpower least. It's counterintuitive. That is, rather than fending off one urge after another, they set up their lives so they minimize the temptations. They use Ulysses contracts. They use their willpower in advance so that they avoid crises and conserve their energy. Here's some examples. You can look at the left side of the screen later, but right now I want you to look at the right side. And this is some data collected from a really cool website. You can check it out. It's called StickK.com. StickK.com. Notice there's 2 Ks at the end of it. Neat little website. You might want to try it yourself. And what they did is you can go to this website and you can make a contract for something you want to do. I want to do this. One example might be lose weight, but you could pick tons of things, saving money, whatever, time studying, whatever it is, I don't know. So you're setting up a contract. Now, imagine people go to, and they just set up a basic contract. There's no penalties if they fail to meet the contract. There's no kind of referee, no third party who's going to keep track of it. And if you look at the bottom there, bottom right, you can see that the success rate in these kinds of contracts is pretty low. It's below 30%. But StickK.com also gives you the option of picking a referee, somebody who will keep an eye on your progress and track it and guide it. Well, people who pick a referee do way better. Over 50% rates of meeting the contract. You can also on StickK, which is kind of a cool idea, you can set up a contract with a financial penalty. So that if you don't meet the contract, you have to pay something. and you pay it to a charity of your choice. Yeah. Um, and of course, the best thing to do is pay it to a charity you don't like that much. Maybe if you're a Republican, you decide to give money to the Democratic Party. If you're a Democrat, you decide to give money to the Republican Party or something. You get the idea. But notice now when there's financial penalties involved, now the success rates are even higher. So these are examples, again, of people kind of upfront saying, I know what I'm going to do, but what I really need to do is somebody to monitor my behavior and put me in a situation where I'll pay a penalty. And if I do that, I think I'll do better. And they're absolutely right. And the StickK.com site, and there are a number of other sites that do that same thing. Okay. So some closing advice here. Here's what we know. And if you're trying to do better, let me close with these ideas. First of all, set only one goal. Make the goal specific. Your goal isn't I want to lose weight, I want to eat healthier. It's I want to lose 1 pound a week. Be specific. Only one goal, only one resolution at a time. I'm not trying to save money, quit smoking, and stop drinking at the same time. One goal at a time. Next, pre-commit. Use the Ulysses strategy. Use Odysseus is the same thing as same person as Ulysses. Do that. So plan your meals in advance. Keep your junk food out of the kitchen. Schedule your workouts with friends. When you go to the store, don't bring your damn credit card with you. Bind yourself to your goals by emailing them to your friends or posting them on Facebook. Pre-commit. Outsource. Use resources like StickK.com. Keep track of what you're doing. Self-monitor for any kind of resolution. People used to say, if you're trying to lose weight, don't weigh yourself every day. But the research says the opposite. Research says weigh yourself every day. The bottom line is keep track. And again, now we've got apps that do things like that, right? We've got things like a Fitbit or whatever, right? We have scales like Withings. I've never seen this scale, but I think it's a really cool idea for a scale. It'll log your weight on your computer, and if you want, it will notify your friends of your weight each day. So now, again, a great way to kind of have some consequences for whether you're following through or not. Don't overreact to a lapse. Yeah, you ever done this? You're on a diet, and then, man, you go off your diet, and you eat too much, and then what you have is what researchers call a counter-regulatory eating, but the rest of us call a what the hell effect, which is listen, I already blew the diet for the day, so I'm just going to eat the whole damn carton of ice cream. So by overreacting to a lapse, I make things even worse. So the trick is to, everybody's going to have a lapse. Don't overreact to the lapse. Tell yourself that you're not stopping forever. Can I resist having a piece of chocolate cake tonight after dinner? Yeah, I can if I say to myself, listen, I can do that. I'm just not going to do it tonight. That's different than saying, oh no, I'm never going to have chocolate cake again. I'm going to give myself permission to do this, just not tonight. So tomorrow is another taste. Tomorrow is another option. And reward yourself. You lose weight, splurge on new clothes. You do something, set aside money, and for something that you really value. There's an app, an exercise monitor called Strive, and it'll monitor your exercise, and it'll make donations to a charity based on how many steps you take each day. Of course, it's your money, but nonetheless, you're rewarding yourself by giving this money to charity, and it makes you feel good to do that. Bottom line is we need to structure our lives to preserve our willpower. Don't schedule endless back-to-back meetings. Avoid all-you-can-eat buffets. Don't make decisions late in the day. Take advantage of anything that's an automatic deduction option or anything you can do in advance that you commit to in advance. Make an appointment to exercise with friends, etc., etc. All of those things are the ways that we do a better job at making self-control. Self-control in the moment is extremely hard to do. You need to do it in advance. Ulysses contracts. So that's the main thing, and I just want to close up here and say a couple things as we've kind of come to a close here. One is, first of all, a couple of you have already submitted your application papers. Clearly people who have no problem with procrastination. So congratulations to you. A number of you have already sent me examples of an application to see if you're doing it right. That's great. I really strongly encourage you to do the quiz for this this last week 10. It's a quiz for this, right? To do it soon in the next few days. Don't wait until Sunday. It's not technically due till Sunday, but here's an example where you can exercise some self-control. Do it soon, because on Sunday you're going to want to be studying for the exam next Monday. If you can get your application paper in early, do it. All that's great. The best advice is you should know from the procrastination paper you read earlier, spread these things out. Maybe say to yourself, I'm going to get my quiz in by Wednesday, my application paper in by Saturday, and that way I'm going to be able to study the rest of Saturday and Sunday for the exam on Monday. But if you leave them all to the very end, worst possible case scenario, we know from the research study that we looked at earlier in the semester and that many people wrote about, that's when people are going to do most poorly on the exam. So you really want to avoid that. Okay, I hope to hear from some of you with questions about the exam or about the application paper. Be delighted to do that. And let me close, as I always do, by launching a poll and just asking you to give me your feedback about this particular session and kind of give me a feel for what was useful or not useful for you here. Get a good sense of that. That's helpful for me to know that, right? Well, I appreciate that feedback. That's very helpful feedback. Good to know and very helpful. And I hope for many of you, it'll give you some ideas about self-control that you might not have had if you're not a strong self-control person. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week. I hope to get your quizzes soon. I hope to get your application papers early. And I'll see you all next Monday, where our exam will start at 6 p.m. Have a good week, everybody.